Welcome to another The Week in 60 Minutes from SpectatorTV, recorded in London this week on Thursday, November the 5th. Now, on this week's show, we will naturally be kicking off with the US election, still unresolved, but maybe getting there. We'll bring you the latest and what it all means. The big news back in Britain, of course, is lockdown number 2 has begun. We're going to look at why, what it means, what the data was that got the government to force this on us. We're going to have a leading statistician in the country, David Spiegelhalter, to talk us through the figures. Fraser, too, will have his famous Nelson charts as well. Terrorism has returned to Europe, both in France in a big way and in Austria too. We're looking at what this means for a clash of civilizations with a Turkish journalist and the rise of Erdogan and the Muslim Brotherhood in that country, in a country that in recent years, most of the 20th century, was heading in a secular direction, no longer. Now, if you subscribe to The Spectator this week in our US election sale, you get 10 weeks of the magazine in print and online for the price of one. 10 for the price of one. Even the politicians in America didn't offer the voters that. Not only that, you get a commemorative Spectator mug. Just go to spectator.co.uk/president to subscribe now. It's only linked to the US election. We'd like to begin with a special thanks to Charles Stanley for supporting this episode of The Week in 60 Minutes. Charles Stanley is one of the UK's leading wealth management firms and one of the oldest companies on the London Stock Exchange. The American elections. The result is still undetermined, but perhaps by the time you see this, Mr. Biden, the Democratic challenger, will have won enough electoral college votes, the magic number is 270, to tip it over the line and into the Democratic camp. That is what looks like what's been happening over the past 12 to 15 hours. It's been going Mr. Biden's way as the later votes come in. And by later, I mean later in terms of being counted. They actually came in early as mail-in votes or as in-person voting beforehand. But in a number of key states, Pennsylvania being one, they don't actually start counting these votes until the polls closed late on the night of the 3rd. Don't ask me why. Part of the problem is the Constitution in America gives the states, most specifically the state legislatures, the right to decide how these elections take place. So you've almost got 50 different sets of rules, which is why it's taking so long. And even if by the time you see this, Mr. Biden has moved into the lead and got the 270 that would suggest he is the next president, there will almost certainly be recounts in Wisconsin and in Georgia, because the victory for Mr. Biden there, if that's what it is so slight. So it's a changing picture, but there are themes, trends, developments, lessons to be learned that we can talk about. And I'm going to do that with James Forsyth, the Spectator's political editor, who has a deep knowledge of American politics, and Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economic correspondent. She is from the colonies, so she's able to tell us all about that too. James, give us your take so far.
So I think what we're seeing so far is that Joe Biden is likely to become president, but this election hasn't been the kind of blue wave that many were expecting. It looks like the Senate will stay under Republican control and the House will be Democrat, but the Democrats' margin there has not increased. And I think lots of people on the Democratic side hope that this would be a moment when Trumpism was repudiated wholesale and the Democrats won control of the whole of the Washington system and could push through big change. I now don't think that is likely to happen. I think the Republican Senate will act as a check on President Biden. I think you'll be much more back to kind of Washington deal making, which, Biden, having been in DC for a very long time, will be adept at. But it'll be that kind of presidency rather than a kind of bold, radical agenda.
Kate, why did it prove to be such a struggle for Joe Biden and the Democrats?
I think the Democrats had a lot of missteps along the way. Joe Biden was not out properly campaigning in the weeks leading up to the election in the way that you would expect a presidential candidate to do so, to be out meeting people. And actually, if you compare the rallies that Donald Trump was having to those Joe Biden was having, sometimes networks would put them up on TV to compare and contrast them. The presidents were dangerous, but ironically, they were also a return to normality. They represented normal and something more exciting going into the next year. You know, big crowds of people cheering, waving American flags. It was what people were used to, what people missed. And then you had Joe Biden with very small numbers of people standing in these circles that were marked by tape, dressed in PPE, listening to a man with a mask on, and it was far less appealing. And now the Democrats have a big problem that Donald Trump is going to try to make their moving into the White House in many ways as difficult as the Democrats did for Donald Trump. I don't mean to directly compare it. I think the president's tweets about how democracy was being undermined was actually undermining democracy. They were deeply irresponsible. But let's not forget the Russia report, the Democrats saying for years that Donald Trump had colluded with foreign powers to gain his position in the White House. They struggled to accept the results of a democratic process 4 years ago, and Donald Trump is not going to hesitate to return the favor. I think the other difficult thing for the Democrats is just how wrong those polls were. Joe Biden has seriously underperformed because the expectations were set so high. They thought this was going to be a huge landslide, but as it turns out, probably because the economy was so strong before coronavirus hit, the president had a lot more support than they expected. And one of the reasons I think this election hasn't been called yet is because it is possible that it comes down to a handful of electoral votes. There's still outstanding states. If they all go to Joe Biden, then this will be a pretty resounding victory in terms of the Electoral College for Joe Biden. But it just wasn't what they were expecting. As James says, there was no blue wave. And that will be very disappointing for the Democrats who didn't just want to win, they wanted to crush Donald Trump.
I always wonder sometimes if the Democrats aren't a little bit like the Bourbons. They seem to know nothing, learn nothing, and then forget nothing. I remember watching Hillary Clinton in the final days of the campaign. It had dawned on her that she was in a bit of trouble in Pennsylvania. So they organized this huge concert in Philadelphia with Beyonce. And it goes out on the network news, television, and all the rest of it. But actually, the reaction of people in what is disparagingly called the flyover states is that we don't want to be lectured to by a bunch of multi-millionaire virtue signalers. So what does Joe Biden do? He throws a concert in Philadelphia with Lady Gaga, who does the same as Beyonce. I mean, don't they learn?
It often appears that they don't. I think what would have been more difficult for Joe Biden is that in that second debate where the former vice president was allowed to speak more and Donald Trump was forced to be a bit more silent, he came out more or less against fracking as something that has led to U.S. energy independence and created a heck of a lot of jobs in America. Now, millions upon millions of ballots will have already been cast by the time we got to that second debate, but I have no doubt that it would have sent some voters back to Donald Trump.
James, the one thing that we cannot say is that this election, even if Mr. Biden is now the next president, I think it'll make him the 46th president of the United States, even if that happens, strangely, contrary to what the opinion polls, to what 95% of the American media, the pundit class, contrary to what they told us, this election was not a repudiation of Trumpism.
No, I think it's quite clear looking at these election results that if it hadn't been for COVID, Donald Trump would have won. And I think it is close enough that, as the Republican pollster Frank Luntzer says, you can believe that if Donald Trump had turned in a slightly more restrained and measured performance in that first presidential debate, the result might have been different again. I think this shows you the deep well of support that there is there, how evenly divided the US is between these two very different ways of kind of thinking about politics. And I think the big question now is, you can, on the one hand, you can say, look, Biden starts off in a weak position with a Republican Senate. The big question is whether he can find a way to revive the kind of lost art of Washington deal-making, whether he can find a way to advance his agenda, not get everything he wants, but get 60, 70% of what he wants, and present that as victory and kind of end the kind of partisan gridlock that has become such a defining feature of US politics in recent years.
Before we can be sure of a Biden presidency, of course, not only have all the votes got to be counted, but we've then got to deal with the litigation that Donald Trump has been promising long before people even started voting. And it is clear that in those states where it is possible to have a recount, Mr. Trump will do so, and the Republican establishment will go along with that. Why wouldn't they? It may be clear where there's some egregious examples of voter fraud or of real question marks over the mail-in ballots or the in-person ballots. They could go along with that too, particularly in states where it's close. But will the Republican leadership indulge in him week after week after week in trying to stop this, James?
I don't think so. I think you've seen the way that Mitch McConnell, the Republican Senate Majority Leader, has said, look, let's let the votes play out. I think, as you say, they're not going to stop Donald Trump from going for recounts or this or that. But if he begins to move into a territory of kind of vexatious lawsuits, and it is worth remembering that Donald Trump's answer to most problems is to sue them. He famously told Theresa May that her approach to the Brexit negotiations should be to sue the EU. And he is a classic New York real estate guy, and suing is what he does. I think if he starts to kind of carry on like that, I think you will see Republicans put more distance between themselves and him, and because I think that because you've got a Supreme Court now, with a healthy conservative majority on it. The Republicans have got control of the Senate. They actually had quite good results at the statewide level in these elections. I don't think they're going to go totally down with the Trump ship now. And I also think back, do you remember when Mitch McConnell said after Trump got COVID, he said, look, I haven't been to the White House for months because I don't think it's a safe environment. I think there are issues on which even Mitch McConnell is prepared to put distance between himself and Donald Trump.
Kate, a win is a win is a win. If Mr. Biden has got 270 or more electoral college votes, that's a win. He becomes the next president. But I can't help feeling, and it's reinforced when I speak to Democrats, that they're relieved they've won, because at one stage on the night it looked like they might not win. But they're hardly triumphant, are they? I mean, it was hardly a convincing victory so far. He was dragged over the winning line, if that's what's happened. He's 78. He's a one-term president, almost certainly. He'll be 82 by the time of the next election, and he hasn't managed to bring the Senate with him. And it's just been a struggle to win in some states, and he lost Florida, the Democrats, yet again. I mean, it's great to win, to be on the winning side, but you would have reservations about the scale or nature of the victory, would you not?
You should. They shouldn't be too chuffed with themselves. I think it's safe to say that their mandate is to not be Donald Trump, but it's hard to say what else their mandate would be from this kind of result. The Democrats were really hopeful that they could pin all of their woes on Hillary Clinton. If Joe Biden had a massive landslide, then the problem was her as a candidate and the fact that she didn't campaign in the right areas or send the right messaging. But now it's clear that America is very divided. The Democrats have not won the battle of ideas. They did not sway as many hearts and minds as they thought they would. Now, that being said, I'm going to slightly disagree with James that if it had not been for COVID-19, Donald Trump would have stormed into victory. I think the way that Trump acted in that first debate, some pollsters suggest, really turned off suburban women. And the way that he acted, the stunts that he pulled after COVID-19 and his personal dealing with that virus, when he came back to the White House, was acting triumphant, was implying that the virus was not a serious risk, that we had cures for it, which we do not. The many Americans that have been affected by now over 200,000 people in America dying from this virus will not have responded well to that. Now, I guess that second stunt wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for COVID-19, but we can be sure there would have been something else. I think it's still clear that Donald Trump's behavior turns off voters, particularly women. I always thought Joe Biden had a decent chance against Donald Trump, but what none of us knew was just how close this would be. So the Democrats are going to have to learn lessons as well as the Republicans, But I would echo James in saying that at least they now have in someone like Joe Biden, who has a reputation for extending his hand, working across the aisle. Quite famously, when he was vice president, when Barack Obama got fed up and couldn't speak to the Republicans anymore over something like raising the debt ceiling, he'd send in Joe Biden, and Joe would work it out. And he is respected by many Republicans across the aisle. So I think we can have little glimmers of hope that Joe Biden and a Republican Senate may be able to work together to get some bipartisan legislation through. It does still feel very far away, not simply because Joe Biden isn't inaugurated until January, but because we know that there are going to be lawsuits. Donald Trump has already launched 3. In Georgia, in Michigan, and Pennsylvania is really the one to watch. He has said he wants to take that to the Supreme Court. It's not simply about the result, but whether or not the state itself should be counting certain votes if they arrived past the election day. So there's a lot to play out before we get to a point where we're talking about President Biden and the Republican Senate working together.
James, if I was Mitch McConnell, I'd be thinking, I'm not going to go to the wire with Donald Trump now. It's clear that the Republicans have lost the White House. I'm really quite glad to see the back of him. He was difficult to get on with. I'm still the Senate Majority Leader. The Republicans still control the Senate, which means President Biden will be very cribbed and confined. We have essentially a Republican majority on the Supreme Court too. And hey, I'm a deal maker. I've done deals in the past with Joe Biden. He's a consummate Washington swamp deal maker. So we'll be fine. And every confirmation he wants to make will have to be passed through me as well. So we'll get on fine with Sleepy Joe. He's a bit old. I'm a bit old as well, Mitch McConnell. It would be nice if the Republicans held on to the White House. But hey, we can live with the next 4 years and start building a post-Republican Trump party.
Yeah, and I think the interesting question will be what kind of Republican Party they try to build. My hunch is that Republicans in the Senate will just rediscover fiscal conservatism now that Donald Trump has gone. They'll be reluctant to sign off on a too big of a stimulus package for the economy, post-COVID economic recovery plan. But I think the interesting question there is, when you look at these results, it's quite clear that the potential gains for the Republicans are down the income scale. That they made gains with the working class, of all ethnicities in the US, and how do they try and build on that? And how do you attempt Trumpism without Trump? And I think it's kind of an interesting question here because on the one hand, Trumpism has really been about Trump and his personality, which, as Kate rightly said, repels as many voters as it attracts. The question is, can you find a way to build a republicanism that is kind of socially conservative, that economically prioritizes the interests of on those on middle and lower incomes, which would be a big deviation from kind of classic Republican economic orthodoxy? Can you do that? And I think that one of the other reasons why this is going to be so interesting is that, as you said about Joe Biden's age, I think we are looking at both parties, both the Republicans and Democrats, having primaries in 2024 to pick their candidate for president. And I think Joe Biden will try and use the fact that he's likely to be a one-term president to do the deals. He'll say, look, you're not guaranteeing my re-election by doing a deal with me, Mitch. This is, I'll be gone. But the question is, which philosophical route do both parties decide to go down in 2024? Because I think if you look at these results, this is how the Democratic Party has just, it looks like, regained its blue wall in the upper Midwest with a white Irish Catholic from Scranton, Pennsylvania. It suggests that the Democrats have a lot more work to do if they are going to make build that blue wall back up to the kind of electoral advantage it was for them until the 2016 cycle.
You see, Kate, a lot of Republicans, or sometimes what were called Republicans in name only, the rhinos, thought if only we can get rid of Donald Trump, we can get our party back. But that isn't going to be the way it will work out, because you get your party back, but then what do you make of it? Because, as James was saying, the American elections now are not won or lost on the East Coast. They're not won or lost on the West Coast. They are solidly Democrat on both sides. They're not won or lost in the South, which is still largely, reliably Republican. they're won or lost in the Midwest, in these Rust Belt states, the Great Lakes states, the one we've talked about endlessly, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and all the rest of it. So you can hardly go back to a kind of country club republicanism of the Rockefellers and Thomas Dewey and all the rest of it. But nor can you go to a Reaganite republicanism of the West Coast, which was limited government, much lower taxes. The people in these Midwest states, they want sort of lunch pail politics. They want better Medicare. They want better schools for their kids. They want more government spending. So I would suggest that neither of the two previous Republican traditions of Ike Eisenhower or of Ronald Reagan, I mean, losing Arizona, if that's what's happened, couldn't be more totemic for them. That was the crucible of Western republicanism. They need to develop a new kind of republicanism, Kate.
Well, I completely agree, Andrew, that the Republican Party has made the mistake for decades now of being far too nostalgic about the 1980s and not thinking about the future and what it means to adapt Republican values and ideas to the world that we live in now, not the world that we lived in then. I think often forgetting that the tax breaks and the deregulation that Ronald Reagan brought in were quite extraordinary for the time. They were radical ideas, and the Republican Party needs new radical ideas of its own. I'm less convinced, however, that all of this comes down to state spending. I think when you're looking at those Rust Belt states, there's a real sense of self-sufficiency in those states. I don't think everybody's desperate for a handout. I think they want more efficiency, and I think they want decent policy. And what we haven't spoken about yet, but we cannot overlook, were those tax breaks that the Republican Party brought in 2017. That was the first time in a long time, I think, that GDP wasn't just a facts and figures on a spreadsheet anymore. The people actually understood what it meant to be more prosperous. They saw the results in that, of higher wages, bonuses from their countries that were directly pegged to those tax breaks. And in that sense, that's a very traditional Republican kind of policy. On the other side, the trade wars are thought to have dampened the U.S. economy. It could have thrived even more had Donald Trump not engaged in a narrative that's thought to appeal to areas like that, but in practice hasn't been as successful. And if we look at those exit polls, Andrew, the economy so far anyway, from the exit polls that we've seen in the data we have, ranks at the top of people's list for the issue that they cared about most. In one exit poll, coronavirus was half that. People really cared about getting the economy back on track. And I think if Republicans can stick to that messaging with some innovative kinds of public policy, and if they can make the sells on healthcare and education that they want to empower the individual, say through school choice and vouchers, which the president was starting to do but didn't make great inroads on, I think there is a new future for the Republican Party that doesn't have to abandon everything that they've stood for, but just recognizes that in 2020 it might have to look slightly different, and you might have to work a little bit harder on the details of the policy to make sure it works for the nation now.
James, a Biden presidency, if that's what it is, and we'll finish on this before we move on. Every major confirmation will have to be, or nomination will have to be run through the Republican Senate. He will have to deal with a Republican, in essence, Supreme Court. He will be in a rush to get some things done because he's probably just a one-term president. He wants a major stimulus packet with a big Green New Deal, so-called spending tagged onto it. He'll need Mitch McConnell to approve that as well. It's not surprising that Wall Street seems to rather have liked the idea of a Biden presidency. The left of the Democrats for now has been cribbed and confined, but there will be a stimulus package, but it won't be out of the ballpark stimulus package. It'll be controlled. So he will be a moderate president.
Yeah, I think Joe Biden's personal politics are moderate. It's worth remembering that he was a DLC Democrat back in the late 80s, the Democratic Leadership Council, the group from which the New Democrats and Bill Clinton came out of. The dings on him in the Democratic primary all came from the left. That he'd sponsored crime bills or welfare bills that were emblematic of that New Democrat approach. So I think you will see him very much govern in that manner. And I think what we will see is, I suspect in 2024, if Joe Biden doesn't run, I suspect we will see a primary challenge to Kamala Harris in that race. as I think the left of the Democratic Party say, you're not doing enough, you're not delivering enough. Already, Alexandra AOC, the New York Congresswoman, kind of standard bearer of Democratic left, has been saying, look, the reason the Democrats didn't get as big a margin with Hispanic voters as they were hoping for was they weren't left-wing enough. They didn't do enough to infuse them. And I think you will see a big argument coming in both parties about which philosophical direction they should go in. And I think there'll be lots of early grouching about, what is Joe Biden delivering for the left?
I think that's right. And it must have dawned on both parties by now that in the 21st century, elections are won or lost in the Rust Belt and the Great Lakes states. And you need to pick a candidate that can win these states, because that's how you win the election now. And I think that's a big problem for Kamala Harris, a West Coast lawyer, because the Democrats have got the West Coast, and her appeal is very limited in these other states. And it means as the Republicans move away from Trump, they can't entirely move away for those elements of Trumpism that appeal to the blue-collar workers, the rural and the small-town workers in these states. So there's going to be a fascinating battle as the Biden presidency settles in for the soul of both the Republican and the Democrat parties. And of course, we'll be across all of that at The Spectator as the months and years ahead. Now today, back here in dear old Blighty, England goes back into lockdown. Comes after a febrile weekend of politics in Westminster, one of the most confusing, probably one of the most badly handled announcements in the modern history of announcements. But that's process. That's politics, which are a problem for Boris Johnson. Why have we gone back into lockdown? What are the numbers that justify England going back into the full Monty, or nearly the full Monty, lockdown? As always, Fraser can tell us, and he's got charts to show what he means. Fraser, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, this is the big question that politicians were asking this week. Only a couple of weeks ago, Boris Johnson was saying, no, we're not going to do another lockdown. That would be disaster for the country. The mental health, the economic damage would be unthinkable. So we're going to continue a policy of local and regional action. Then he abandoned this. Why? The answer, we were told, lay in the data. But what we saw on Saturday last weekend, it was a debacle, the like of which we haven't seen for a long time and hopefully won't see again. The first graph we saw came not from the Prime Minister, but from a leak to the BBC on Lorna Koonsberg, the political editor, her Twitter feed. She came out with a graph purporting to show up to 4,000 daily deaths from the second wave of COVID. Now, given that there were only 1,000 deaths in the peak of the first wave, that's looking at a second wave not just bigger than the first, but potentially 4 times bigger. Now, at the time it was said, now surely she's got hold of a rogue graph. It can't really be as bad as that. But when the actual press conference came along, then yes, that graph came back, and we saw yet again up to 4,000 deaths. That's one of the scenarios. And there were 4 other scenarios, all of which showing daily deaths peaking significantly higher than the 1,000 a day that we saw in the first wave. Now, we've actually got a hold of these figures at The Spectator because at the time it wasn't clear what the figures were, it wasn't clear what the assumptions were, it wasn't even clear who had made the assumptions. The projections had been released without any context, without any labels. All the public saw, and we're talking 15 million people waiting to watch Strictly Come Dancing. You couldn't get a bigger audience for a government announcement than that. All they were told, the takeaway, was out of all of these scary graphs, up to 4,000 dead. Well, so far, we're now tracking it on The Spectator. You can see the actual figure at the bottom. The actual deaths are still running around 230, 240 a day. And you can also see that by now, even at this stage, one of the scenarios shown on Saturday has Britain at about 1,000 deaths. So already, by the time it was shown to the public, it was way out of date and way higher than it needed to be. Now, this isn't the first time we've been showing scary scenarios at number 10. It wasn't so long ago that Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Officer, came up with a graph showing what it would be like if cases were to double every 7 days. The graph showed up to 50,000 confirmed COVID cases a day by the middle of October. At the time he said this was a projection, not a forecast, but you can be, if you're watching at home, you can be forgiven for not quite understanding the distinction between these two. It was the only graph that he showed. And as we can see here, the actual number came in at less than half that. That was for the middle of October. Even now, we're running at about 25,000 cases a day. You can see the daily readings in pink and the 7-day moving average is a red line. What that shows is there isn't much of an increase. This sudden surge that we were told about in the press conference just isn't coming through in the daily data. On the contrary, it seems that things are flattening. Now you might say, okay, then maybe the young people have stopped getting coronavirus, but the older, the over 60s, that's what matters. That's true, but let's have a look then at the virus amongst the over 60s. We see even these levels are starting to flatten now in many regions of the UK. In other words, it looked as if the government's regional and local strategy might have been working. This was a point Theresa May made when she gave her presentation to the House of Commons. She was saying, look, why has the government given up when it seems that we haven't had a proper analysis of the impact of the strategy we've just abandoned? The evidence from Liverpool, she says, shows that the number of cases is falling. She wanted a proper assessment of the regional policy before moving to national lockdown. We'd seen lots of figures shunted out without much explanation of what they meant. And if you have a look at the Liverpool figures Theresa May is referring to, we can see now that the number of cases a day in Liverpool are almost half of what they were in the peak of last month. Now, this is not a picture of a virus running out of control in Liverpool. And it's in Liverpool where the government's next big experiment will start. We're going to see mass testing in Liverpool. Everyone in the city is being offered a COVID test, whether they are sick or not. And the government sees in this a prototype of rolling it out for the whole country, potentially 10 million tests a day, we're told. And that might be our get out of jail free card, or at least our get out of lockdown card. But then this raises so many questions about data. If you're doing 10 million tests a day, what proportion of those will be false positive? If you test false positive, will you be isolated on a false premise? And will we be once again lost in a fog of data? It seems right now as if we've gone into lockdown based not on what's actually happening on the ground, but on some models suggesting what might be happening. These are models which only today the UK Statistics Authority has taken the very unusual step of reprimanding the government for its use of data. It says, in its words, there is the potential to confuse the public and to undermine confidence in statistics if you use scary charts in this way. So it's really unusual now to have lockdown. You couldn't get a bigger measure than this, justified on the basis of statistics, which even the UK Statistics Authority said were misrepresented when presented to the public on Saturday. Back over to you, Andrew.
Fraser, thank you for that and showing the charts. I'm delighted to say we're joined by one of the country's leading statisticians, Professor David Spiegelhalter, Winton Professor of Public Understanding of Risk at the University of Cambridge, formerly President of the Royal Statistics Society. Professor, welcome to Spectator TV. I'd like to just put a general point to you, and then you can discuss with Fraser some more of the details. But a lot of people are beginning to think that the senior scientists and the politicians from Mr. Johnson down have been complicit in concocting scary scenarios with statistics that are never properly interrogated to kind of scare us into compliance with whatever policy it is they want us to follow. So we had the 50,000 cases, which was merely an arithmetical projection by the middle of October. And then we've had this more complicated chart with 4,000 deaths if we don't do anything. We're beginning to wonder if this isn't the kind of propaganda dictators use to keep their populations in place. What do you say to that?
Okay, this is quite a difficult issue. First of all, I've got to admit a conflict of interest, possibly, that I am on a non-executive director on the board of the UK Stats Authority that oversees the Office for Statistical Regulation that just has made that announcement that Fraser referred to. But I'm speaking completely personally at this stage, and I have to say, yeah, I'm really not at all keen on the sort of graphs that Fraser has been showing. And that's why I fully support the statements that's been made by the OSR. And I think it's really unfortunate, because I also personally believe that that sort of model, the 4,000 peak, which I'd like to come back to a bit more in a moment, it was actually unnecessary in order to make the argument. Fraser's analysis was very reasonable when it concerned those speculative graphs being used, in a very way to, I think, influence people's emotions. But I don't think he's correct when he says that the data itself does not justify measures. Now, I'm not going to say I support the lockdown. I'm not going to say I support anything. That's not my job. I'm a statistician, and I look at the data, but only the data concerning COVID. And of course, anybody making a decision about lockdown, where we know it has ramifications way beyond just COVID impact in terms of hospitalizations and deaths, obviously has to take that broader picture into account, which I cannot do. But I do believe that just looking at the data alone, and Chris Whitty, this is what he said the next day, where he said, I don't use those projections, I just look a few weeks ahead to the Science and Technology Committee in Parliament. If you just look at the current trends, we are, in a very difficult position by the end of this month. Now, I admit, actually, or not admit, I'm in a way pleased that cases have largely plateaued. The picture that's shown in Liverpool and other tier 3 cases, I think it has worked. These cases have reduced. However, in other parts of the country, which the graph showed, they're going up. And in actually the lower risk areas, the West Country, the South East, and some Midlands, they're steadily going up. So this plateau is made up of two conflicting trends. But the other thing is, this plateau, which is 20 to 25,000 cases a day, is absolutely certain to lead to consequences over the next 4 weeks. Roughly speaking, 2,000 to 2,500 hospitalizations per day in 2 weeks, and maybe a week after that, 500 deaths a day. And there's nothing we can do about that now. No measure would do anything, would change that. That's in the die of the number of people who are currently infected. Now, even if you think the tier system is working, and I'm just guessing at the sort of discussions that must have been going on last week, where it's clear the tier system, I think is working to some extent. R has been coming down. We're moving towards an R perhaps of 1. But all that does is stabilise the situation at 20 to 25,000 positive cases a day. And that's pure just looking at the data, and that would not be sustainable. You can do it as a peak, but 2,500 hospitalizations per day, 500 deaths a day, carrying on for week after week is simply not sustainable in the NHS, because we have to keep the NHS open for everybody else. That was the mistake made in the previous wave that everyone's very keen to avoid again. The NHS must be open for business for everybody else. COVID, absolutely right, should not trump the general illness and health of the nation.
Fraser?
What I'm interested to know, David, is what we've seen in the figures in the last week or 2 weeks to change the government's policy so radically. A couple of weeks ago, Boris Johnson had his face set against lockdown, set his face against circuit breakers. And then all of a sudden we were given these figures on Saturday night to suggest why the situation had changed. Now, I couldn't see much in these figures that was a material change of a situation we thought we were dealing with a week ago. And when you look, and also I'd be interested to know whether you think it's appropriate to show modelling of that nature to a primetime Saturday audience. It seems to me to be a rather strange way to use statistics and may have a sort of contradictory effect of making people far less willing to believe what the government says if they think the government is exaggerating the case. Whether you're doing this, I'm talking about a pandemic, or simply making a presentation to your company, you surely ought to be coming up with figures which are regarded as realistic, so people think you're not in the business of trying to scare anybody with figures whose assumptions you don't disclose.
I absolutely agree, and I said that I don't think the use of that graph was inappropriate would be an understatement, I think, and a potentially extreme, as it has been, extremely damaging for what I think is a reasonable case that something serious must be done, extra interventions must be done, which I do believe. So get back to that graph. First of all, I really must ask you, don't keep on dragging it out. I mean, I know you can drag it out and say, oh, well, this shows this isn't happening, but it's unfair to the scientists. That was produced as clearly it wasn't part of any official document at all. It was produced at the beginning of October under different assumptions. The Cambridge model that goes up to 4,000 a day, they'd already changed twice and reduced dramatically by the middle of last week. And so it was out of date. It was never meant for, and it was never in a document that was going to be later released. It was somehow leaked. We won't go into that. I don't know how that happened. And then it appeared. And actually, it's bad enough that it appeared on Saturday. And then to introduce it, you put it in again in the papers for Parliament for the debate yesterday. I really think, no, that's just not on. Really. And it so damages the case and increases, as you said, the possibility of people mistrusting, feel that they're being influenced and manipulated by the data. Why I get really upset about this, as you can tell, as a statistician, that I feel the trends going on the data are serious enough on their own. They didn't need to use this graph. This is what is going on is powerful. You ask, well, what changed? I think, again, I'm purely guessing here. Maybe they thought that the tier system was going to be more effective in bringing R down below, down to 1, even below. And what they found is that it was bringing down infections in these severe areas, like Liverpool. It has worked there. But elsewhere in the country, it's going up really quite dramatically. The fastest increases are in the southwest. People are getting it. I'm from Devon, and my family said, people are getting it for the first time. They didn't get it in the first wave. They're now getting it. So you could see that something big was needed, because otherwise we would be in for an unsustainable winter, even if the infection stayed at a steady level. That is not a sustainable level for them to stay at.
Fraser, what's the answer to that?
Well, it's interesting that I wonder to whom we turn now for figures to find out what's going on, if not the government. I completely take what David says, that these figures the government showed us were never intended by those who drew them to be presented to an audience of 15 million people. But it makes it harder than ever, right, to get the signal from the noise. To look at every day, we at The Spectator have started a new data hub, data.spectator.co.uk, updating every single day the various figures so people can try to work out what's happening. I guess the question is, where are we heading to in 2 or 3 weeks' time? And there doesn't seem to be an Office for Budget Responsibility, a neutral body here that you can look at to get a balanced view. And that, which in this current pandemic, this is a little bit worrying. But the other thing I'm really interested to know David's opinions on is what you think about mass testing. We're going to start in Liverpool. We're going to get, to test everybody in the city. That's quite an undertaking. It has been, we've seen this happen in Chinese cities. We've seen this happen in Slovenia in some places. But if we do end up in a situation where you're testing the whole population of a city, even a country, at 10 million people a day, what are the potential there for false positives and for data to give a potentially misleading picture?
Okay, great questions. The first one first. A wonderful what the Spectator is doing on their data. This is great stuff. So all I can do is recommend, just do a 3-week projection. You don't need any fancy models for that. I mean, my rule of thumb, as I've mentioned before, you just take the number of positive cases each day, divide it by 10, and that's the number of hospitalizations in 2 weeks. Divided by 50, that's the number of deaths in 3 to 4 weeks. So, it's that simple. and it's not bad. It's not bad at all. And that's nothing to do with models, and it's nothing to do actually with any policies. We're stuck with it. So I think, just do a short-term projection and you'll realize, whoa, this is not sustainable. Okay, mass testing, very important indeed. And it's to do with the false positives is the crucial thing. If you're testing, if people kind of think that a 1% false positive rate sounds great, 99% accurate. No, it's useless for a test, because if you test 1 million people in a day, 1% is 10,000 people falsely being told they've got COVID and having to isolate and that sort of thing. And that would be unacceptable. So there's 2 things things to say. First of all, for a decent test, like a current PCR test, the false positive rate is not 1%, 1 in 100. It's much less than 1 in 2,000. It's actually very small indeed. And so there's been a whole lot of misinformation about how most of the tests being done are false positives. This is complete nonsense and utter misinformation. So don't believe any of that stuff. So the PCR test is actually pretty good, even for mass testing, when the prevalence is low, and that means that it becomes less reliable. But we're not going to be doing PCR tests for this mass testing. We're going to be doing much shorter, briefer tests that have been done. If their false positive rate is as low as that, then actually it won't be too big. It's manageable. If it isn't, they're going to have to do a repeat test to make it. So essentially, if you've got a false positive rate, if it were 1%, which is far too high on its own for mass testing, but then if you do it again, either with it the same or with another PCR test, then again, you hugely reduce the false positive rate. So I think that it's not just a matter of testing everybody. If you're positive, you've got to isolate or something. I don't think that would be, unless it's a really accurate test, is not a feasible strategy for mass testing. But actually a two-stage strategy where people who test positive then have to test again 2 days later seems completely achievable. It does seem achievable. And in the end, I think it's going to be the only way to get things going again. But we don't yet know, I don't think, the quality of these tests. We're buying millions of these things, but I would like to have a lot more evidence on what their actual false positive rate is and their false negative rate. I mean, how many people are they picking up?
Professor Spiegelhalter, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for your contribution today. I hope you come back on Spectator TV as events develop and we can discuss more of these issues with you. It's been a pleasure to listen to what you had to say today and to help us understand more what is happening. That was David Spiegelhalter of the University of Cambridge. I just want to touch briefly on the politics of this with James and Kate before we then move on to our final item today, which is Turkey. James, speaking in the past week or so to Tories, I've been struck by just how hostile backbenchers, donors, the Tory faithful, how hostile they are now about Boris Johnson. They almost don't really like him anymore.
I think there is a huge opposition to lockdown. You saw 30-odd Tory MPs rebelling last night on this second lockdown. And I think the big question which Downing Street has got to come up with an answer with is, this is a tactical lockdown about, as David Spiegelhalter was saying, about hospital capacity. What is your strategy for avoiding another one? Because it is worth remembering that when SAGE, the scientific advisors, initially suggested this kind of circuit breaker style lockdown, they admitted that you would probably need another one of these later in the winter. And I think if you came back to the House of Commons in January or February saying, right, we now want you to vote for a third lockdown, I think you would see a really big Tory rebellion then. And I think you would be in a position where Boris Johnson was having to rely on Labour votes to get the policy through. And that never ends well for any Prime Minister when you have to start relying on opposition votes to get your business through the House of Commons.
Kate, it's quite hard to remind ourselves that less than a year ago, Boris Johnson took the Tories to their biggest victory since Maggie Thatcher landslide against Neil Kinnock in 1987, and he won all these old Labour seats in the north. He was the saviour of the Tory party. He was the new Tory party of the north as well as the south. Labour was in a mess. I mean, the transformation, the decline in his status in the eyes of Tories in 11 months is quite breathtaking.
I think the fall from grace has happened much more recently. Actually, you don't have to go back to December and watch the timeline from there. If we go back to March and April, the nation really rallied behind the Prime Minister. They understood that the nation, it turned out, wasn't properly prepared when this pandemic hit. He himself suffered from the virus. So from MPs to your average Joe on the street, I think the Prime Minister was really supported in the actions that he took, even when he had to lock the country down. The problem came this summer, and it's become very clear now that the right things were not done to build up capacity in the NHS. billions of pounds instead were put behind a test, trace, and isolate scheme, which hasn't worked. It's been woeful. It's experienced U-turns. There have been so many problems with it. And unfortunately, we now find England back in lockdown. We have circuit breakers, we have fire breakers, and many people are now asking, what did you do? This, I think, is where the fall from grace really has begun. It's going to be a difficult winter season for Boris Johnson, as he probably faces more rumbles and slightly increasing opposition to the measures that he's taking. But I think the real breaking point comes next spring. The Chancellor today announced that he is extending the furlough scheme till March 2021. That means that essentially for a year, some people will be sitting at home having the government paying their wages. And when we talk about these policies trickling into the new year, I think that's when people get deeply frustrated, whether they're in Parliament, business owners, employees. Everybody starts to think, wait a second, this can't go on for another year. This cannot define 2021 in the way that it's defined this year. So I suspect that's when things get really difficult for the Prime Minister. Now, perhaps the breaking point coincides with mass testing, perhaps it coincides with a vaccine, but if it doesn't, and we have to learn how to live with this virus and no mechanism is in place, I think that's when you could see the Conservative Party take a real change in their attitude towards the Prime Minister.
Well, thank you for that, Kate. Now, while most of Western Europe has been having to come to terms with the prospect of new lockdowns, almost as tough as the lockdowns of March and April, it has also had to contend with a new wave of terrorism. Not a terrorism on a spectacular scale, killing tens and tens and tens or even hundreds of people, but individual lone wolves causing mayhem in Nice, in Avignon, and in the latest of all in Vienna. And it coincides with a spat, more than a spat, between France and Turkey, where relations are probably at a modern low, and part of the battle of Islamism, as President Macron sees it, has been to bring them into contention with Turkey. At the same time, the history of the 21st century, which is only 2 decades old, which was supposed to be and to see the final success, confirmation of democracy after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and more Latin American countries becoming democratic as well. Instead of seeing that final triumph of democracy, what the history of the 21st century so far has been the rise of authoritarianism and the rise of the strongman. Authoritarians becoming totalitarians, like the Chinese Communist Party with President Xi. Russia going back into authoritarianism with President Putin. Erdogan, president in Turkey, again a strong man and increasingly authoritarian. Same in Brazil, consolidation of power around the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia. And of course, this little rocket man in North Korea is still with us as well. So you see a trend there. And I'd just like to work out in the case of Turkey, which is so close to Europe, and for many years we had thought was becoming part of the European way of doing things, now seems to be going in a different direction. Is it part now of a clash of civilizations? Is it part of this growth of strongman leaders? Is it part of this growing authoritarianism? I'm delighted to say we're joined by Ece Temelkuran, an award-winning Turkish journalist, author of How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship. Ece, is it right now to regard President Erdogan in Turkey as an authoritarian?
Definitely, absolutely.
Can you explain to us how this has come about in Turkey? Because for a huge part of the 20th century, we looked at Turkey as going way back to Ataturk and so on, as becoming more of much more of a secular state, of a separation of which in Western Europe you would call a separation of church and state, the modernization of Turkey, the Europe looking way for Turkey, even hoping at one stage for membership of the European Union. It was definitely a democracy, flawed in places, but all democracies have their flaws as we see across the Atlantic at the moment. What has brought this about, which many people will regard as a reversal? Why?
Well, there is this dominant narrative, both in Turkey and outside Turkey, about the country that Turkey was a secular country until Recep Tayyip Erdogan decided to take it, towards a different direction. Whereas I see it, from where I see it, it all goes back to 1980 military coup. Before that, secularism was not completely healthy and fortified maybe, but after 1980 military coup, the top generals of the army cooperated with religious sects, one of them being Fethullah Gülen movement, later that became very important not only in Turkish politics but in international politics as well. So, and at the time, as you know, there was the Cold War, and not only in Turkey but also in Afghanistan, in several other places, radical Islam or political Islam, for that matter, was utilized by NATO against USSR, former USSR. So these guys were like sort of recruited by an ideology to struggle against communism, the danger of communism. And then when their job was over after the Berlin Wall came down, they were like sort of jobless. So after 1990s was quite important in that sense, because that was the time political Islam became more mainstream, so to speak. And then when 2000s arrived, when especially after 9/11, there was another ideological project, if you will, which is called moderate Islam, and Turkey became the role model for moderate Islam. And the idea was democracy can go together hand in hand with moderate Islam, and Turkey can be the example country for the rest of the Muslim world to show that democracy can flourish in Muslim countries. So I don't know if you remember, Obama was praising Mr. Erdogan alongside with several other Western leaders.
He was one of the 5 most trusted international leaders, Mr. Obama told us.
Yeah, and it's only 10 years ago. And after 2007, when Mr. Erdogan came to power for the second time, things got a little bit troublesome. And after 2013, after the Gezi uprising, when the entire world saw that the things are not what they want to see in Turkey, then on things started getting down the hill. But now, of course, all these supporting masses of Mr. Erdogan has been mobilized and organized and mobilized around around religion. So you cannot just stop it all of a sudden when it becomes, problematic.
Can I ask you, in your view, what is President Erdogan's strategic goal for Turkey? What does he want it to be in the decade that is now ahead of us? How does he want to position Turkey in the region and the wider world?
Well, this is an interesting question, because one wants to believe that there is a plan there. But for such leaders like Mr. Erdogan or Putin or several others now emerging everywhere in Europe, and like Trump, I do not think that they have a plan or an ideology or a perspective. What they want is power, and then more power. End of story. So whatever fits their political agenda or desire for power, they go that way. Because Mr. Erdogan was quite enthusiastic about Europe and being in good relations with Western countries during his first term, because then that was the necessary move for him to stay in power. But then it became insignificant for him. So if I can say that, to be in good relations with Europe, because there was Trump, there was Putin, and to keep himself in the game, the only thing he should have done was to keep his relations good with these two superpowers of the world.
But where does he think he's going now is what I'm trying to find out.
Well, Turkey's relation to West has been always problematic. West has been this higher moral ground in terms of democracy, human rights, and so on. Since Western countries, especially European countries, lost their last residue of moral superiority, so to speak, during the war in Syria and during the refugee crisis, it is so easy for Erdogan to have to feel superior in that sense. But I do not think that he has a plan. It changes every day, so I don't see a consistent plan or project there.
Well, let me ask you just one final question then. If there's not a plan, is there though a tactic? Is it likely that Turkey under Mr. Erdogan will now become more repressive, more authoritarian? I mean, as I understand it, already the media is pretty much under his control, most of it. That it's a country where you have to be careful what you say, that there is a prevalent secret police presence and so on. It has elements of authoritarianism. Is that likely, sadly, to get worse before it ever gets better?
Absolutely. Because right now, economic power, the entire political machine is under his control. And what he's trying to do now is erase the idea of rule of law from Turkey. After the coup attempt in 2016, as far as I know, 4,000 judges were dismissed suddenly in very short period of time. They were replaced with loyal judges, and lately we have seen meddling with constitutional court as well. So if he gets that one, that part of the machine, that part of the state under his control, I think there won't be anything else to unleash his desire for ultimate power. All
right. Ece Temelkuran, the author of How to Lose a Country, The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship, award-winning Turkish journalist. Thank you for joining us on Spectator TV. That's just about it for this week. Thanks to our guests, once again to our very special sponsor, Charles Stanley. Charles Stanley, one of the oldest UK leading wealth management firms, also one of the oldest firms on the London Stock Exchange. Remember, if you subscribe to The Spectator this week, to our US election sale, if you take part in this US election sale, you'll get 10 weeks of the magazine, print and online, 10 weeks all the way up to Christmas and beyond for the price of one. 10 for the price of one. Not only that, you get a commemorative Spectator mug as well to drink your coffee or tea or the brandy you slip into it. Go to spectator.co.uk/president to subscribe now. Send any thoughts to SpectatorTV at spectator.co.uk. Join us again next Thursday for another The Week in 60 Minutes. Bye-bye.